Hi, this is the Apologist Bookshelf, and I'm Gary Zacharias. I really appreciate you joining me today. I just came across a book that I wanted to share with you. I've read about half of it so far. It's not a brand new book. It came out in 2021. It's by Metaxas, and it's called Is Atheism Dead? And I'm sure you've heard of Metaxas. His books have, what's it say here? They've been translated into 25 languages. Of course, he had his radio show. He's got that conversation series called Socrates in the City. And he lives with his family in New York City. Of course, Bonhoeffer's maybe the most famous book that he put out. So on the back of this book, it's called Is Atheism Dead? And I just love to read what some people have to say about a book before I start in. And here's what somebody said. This is Dennis Prager. Of course, Dennis is a well-known, nationally syndicated radio talk show host. And he said, when Metaxas comes out with a new book, I have a problem. I know I'll have to read it. I've read all of his books because I learned an immense amount from them and because they're difficult to put down. This latest book features Metaxas versus atheism. It's not a fair fight. That's a good one. Read Is Atheism Dead? And you'll understand why. Also, James Tour gives it a thumbs up, and he's a professor of chemistry, maybe one of the most famous nano engineers in the world today. Been on a list of 100 most famous, chemists. Stephen Meyer, who's written Return of the God Hypothesis. He calls it a beautifully written, highly readable compendium of scientific, archaeological, and historical evidence. Highly recommended for anyone wrestling with the big questions. And then one of my favorite authors and people, I had a chance to meet with him and talk to him, Hugh Ross, Ph.D. He's the founder and president of Reasons to Believe. Although I think he recently retired and Fuzz Rana has now taken over. Here's what Hugh Ross had to say. With great oratorical skill and irrepressible humor, Metaxas engages lay readers with the story of how recent discoveries have made atheism scientifically, historically, and philosophically untenable. So again, the title is Atheism Dead? Kind of I guess you'd say a comeback to that Time magazine famous article that they put on the cover years back, said, Is God dead? And he's saying, no, God's not dead. So the book, just to give you kind of a feeling for what he's trying to do here, Metaxas says he wants to tackle 5 things in the book. And one is the universe getting started. What is science now kind of leaning toward as far as how the universe got started? Secondly, the way things are fine-tuned for life here, which is a huge deal. I think that's one of the best ways to approach somebody who's not a believer and talk to them about the fine-tuning, because it's really hard to argue with it. And then third is the origination of life. How did life originate, he says. And so he spends a chapter on that. So that's his third area. Fourth area is biblical archeology. And I didn't know a lot of this. I thought it was really a fascinating section. I'm not finished with it, but I'm enjoying that one. And the last section is looking at atheism itself and famous atheists. And how is that working out for them? How is that life working out? And the answer is not all that well. Okay, so I want to start right from the beginning here about what he has to say about the beginning of life. And he said in Time magazine, it was 1966, where they asked, Is God dead? And he said 5 things since then have arisen to challenge that consensus that all the secularists came up with. And I mentioned those to you, the Big Bang and the fine-tuning and the life from non-life and archaeology and the atheism itself and how that's turned out. So let's look at the first chapter. In the beginning was the Big Bang. And he said about 1911, he said there's a time in the world's history where it was drifting away from the idea of God. But he said a certain German genius came up with what we call the theory of relativity. And of course, we know about Einstein. He said it basically ends in 1964 when they discovered the background radiation from the early universe. And so he said inside of that is that change in attitude and the swinging away from secularism and heading toward instead of maybe a belief in God. So he said, go back, and he said, you have a man named Edwin Hubble, and he began looking at the heavens in 1919. He used a brand new beautiful, huge telescope up in Mount Wilson, up above L.A. It was a 100-inch telescope, meaning the mirror. This was a reflective telescope, meaning it just bounced light. It wasn't like a spyglass you look through, but it was a mirrored ground lens up there that acted as a reflector, and 100 inches across. So it's pretty good size. So Hubble finds out, of course, things are expanding. And people were really shocked by that, because up until then, all they knew was that the Milky Way was probably the entire universe. That was all there was to it. And he said, you go back further, you got Einstein. He puts out a paper that suggests the universe was expanding. But Einstein didn't like that. And so all he did, this cracks me up, because Einstein, famous scientist, he didn't like the idea of what his calculations were implying as far as the start of the universe, so he just fudged things. And he introduced into his equation something he called the cosmological constant. And that'll settle that. He said, well, not so fast. In 1927, you have a priest, Father Lemaitre, who is a Belgian Catholic priest. He discovered Einstein's equations did lead to an expanding universe, and he said those actually prove it. And so then, as he said, Hubble takes a look and sees that the universe actually is expanding. And so now we've got the idea of a beginning to the universe, and that was horrifying to some scientists. They had some objections, and it wasn't really scientific objections. They said they wanted infinite time. Why would they want infinite time? Well, for the atheists among them, if you have enough time, after all, everything's possible, right? A pin can fall out of your pocket and land straight up and not fall over. All sorts of, you can throw a dart and it would go around the earth, right? Just if you have enough time, right? Anything is a possibility. And so here it comes, though, this idea of the Big Bang. And it said people were worried and wondering about that, and it said that there was a pushback on it. Some people said, well, it's just a fad, right? The whole expanding universe. And so they said, no, it's a static universe. It's been here forever. And they call that the steady state theory. And the big guy behind that was somebody named Fred Hoyle. And he hated that idea of a Big Bang. And so he called it. He was the first one to call it a Big Bang. And he was kind of like going blah, 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 toward that idea. But it kind of backfired. Now it's lasting, right? So everybody calls it the Big Bang. Well, the catch is, how would you detect a Big Bang and see if it really did happen? Well, they said you had a Big Bang fireball, basically, at the beginning. That heat, of course, would expand and scatter across the entire universe. Is there a way to measure that? They said it would be billions of degrees when it first started, but now it'd be scattered through this hugely, impossibly large universe. Could they find them? Well, we had two people, kind of interesting, Bell Labs in New Jersey. Two people were radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. And they kept having this crazy noise coming from their radio antenna when they were trying to do their own research. They got so frustrated. And so they disassembled everything and they reassembled the electronics. They still heard that faint hissing. Maybe it was pigeons. So they, you can imagine these scientists, they're shoveling away pigeon droppings. They shooed away the birds, but they kept hearing that hissing. And they heard it and they thought maybe it was rivets. But finally, they had read about some people saying there could be some background radiation from the beginning of the universe. And so that's what they discovered, that was the case. They turned that into a Nobel Prize. They had discovered actual proof of the Big Bang. And there's no way around it. There it was. They said it even got worse for the people that didn't like it. In the 1990s, NASA launched a satellite called COBE, C-O-B-E, to try to detect this microwave background radiation. They did. And here's the interesting part. The Big Bang was not perfectly uniform as far as that explosion. It had some lumpiness, I guess is a good word for it, some lumpiness that allowed bits of matter to create and clump together, and those turned into stars and planets and all these objects in space. It was amazing. So now you understood not only the Big Bang, but what came right after it. So that's, I'm going to skip over some of this here. And so we've got the Big Bang starting. Okay, I'm going to do one more part here because I think this is terrific too. So now you got a universe from nothing. That sounds like Genesis, doesn't it? Yeah. And then he's got a quote at the end of that chapter, by the way. Robert Jastrow, he's of the Goddard Institute, and he's an agnostic Jew, but he wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. And here's what he said when looking at the whole Big Bang idea. He said, the discovery of a definite cosmic beginning is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. They've always accepted the word of God. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. It's unexpected because science has had such extraordinary success in trying the chain of cause and effect backward in time. For the scientist who has lived by his faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Isn't that a great line? Yeah, so it's like science actually ended up back at Genesis 1. Pretty funny. Well, let's just touch a little bit on this next chapter that deals with the fine-tuning element here. And he said to start with, Christopher Hitchens, who's one of the 4 atheists that were so prominent in the new atheist movement, said one time somebody was asking him when he was riding in a car, he said, what's the best argument for the other side? In other words, arguing for the existence of God. Now, Hitchens is usually kind of a smart aleck, and you expect him to give some kind of silly answer. But it said he did answer quickly, and he answered honestly. What he say is the best argument for the existence of God? Here are the exact words. It's the fine-tuned argument, the fine-tuning, that 1 degree, 1 hair of difference. And he says, even though it doesn't prove design, doesn't prove a designer, you have to spend time thinking about it. It's not a trivial argument. We all say that. So, yeah. So what is the fine-tuning argument? Metaxas says it's just that there are certain things about the universe and even our planet Earth that seem so extremely perfectly calibrated they could hardly be coincidental. And it says it's almost like what they call the Goldilocks principle, just 2 directions in which things can be, bad. They can be off one way or off the other. Everything has to be exactly right. And he says the fascinating thing is that the more time that passes and the more that science looks at these things, this fine-tuning actually gets stronger because science is finding more and more about it. So he said, let's start with Carl Sagan, right? So we'll go back. And it says in the late 60s, early 70s, they asked Sagan, what do you need to have life on a planet? What has to be exactly right? And Carl Sagan, just 2 things, he said. 1, you have to have a star that's kind of like our sun, and you have to have a planet that's the right distance. Well, good heavens, since you got billions of planets in the universe, trillions maybe, then those 2 conditions would be pretty easy to meet. There's got to be just tons of planets out there that would support life. And he calculated there would be a lot. The idea that life is just all over the universe. Oh, but not so fast. Said not long after Sagan made that bold pronouncement, they're finding more and more of the conditions that had to be exactly right for life, way more than the 2 that Sagan mentioned. And so here are just a couple of them. Let's start with 1, the size of the Earth. Okay, said we look at the size of the Earth and we say, big deal, what would that have to do with life? But the size has to be exactly right. If our Earth was any bigger or smaller, you don't get life here. Why? Well, here's just one reason. He said this is the simplest reason. It's our magnetic field. So what are we talking about there? It's hugely important. If we had an Earth that was slightly smaller, you'd end up with a weak magnetic field, and then the solar wind, and that's all those stream of charged particles, electrons and protons and some alpha rays. They're blasting at us every moment from the sun. But if you can't protect against that, you're in trouble, right? So not good. Well, what about the other side of things? What if the Earth was larger? Well, then you'd have really powerful gravity so that no water or methane or carbon dioxide would ever escape our atmosphere. We'd end up with an atmosphere so thick we couldn't breathe it. It'd be almost viscous, almost fluid. Okay, so what else about the Earth? Well, pretty obvious that if we're slightly closer to the sun, our water would have evaporated. If we were further away, all water would have been frozen. Now, Carl Sagan did mention that. But what about the big planets out further than we are? Jupiter and Saturn, for example, said they're like planetary linebackers. They run interference for us. They shield us, in a sense, from meteorites and asteroids that just be pelting us all the time. All right, what about the moon? Is the moon anything special? Well, the moon, by the way, nobody knew exactly how it formed, and now they're saying an object smashed into the Earth at just the right angle and the right speed, and it was pretty cool what it did. You say, well, why would that make a difference? Well, it got rid of a super thick atmosphere that was on the early Earth, and suddenly it was a thinner atmosphere, something that you could breathe. So it was thin enough for sunlight to go through and thin enough for people to breathe. And that object that smashed into us actually increased the Earth to the size of Earth today, so that was good. And then the object that smashed into us that went away didn't fly off completely into space. It collected, congealed, and it formed the moon. And the moon that came out of it was exactly the right size for life on the Earth. Okay, the size of our moon, he points out, is huge when you compare it to other moons in the solar system, but it keeps us to having the right seasonal variation. It controls a wobbling axis that we might have had without it. So it said it settles things down, it steadies us, gives us stable climates. And of course, it's just the right size for an eclipse. Isn't that interesting? It exactly covers the sun's surface, so we can look at things beyond the sun's disk. It said you could measure and understand things that would have been impossible. It said we've learned things about the corona. We've learned how the sun throws up solar flares, which can change what's called space weather. That can influence our satellites. And said it even helped us discover helium. Okay, so maybe at the very end of this chapter here, he talks about where we are in the universe. He said, even the placement of Earth within the universe is an example of fine-tuning. Isn't that incredible? So it says our solar system is located on an inner edge of an arm of the galaxy, not in the center, not out at the far edge. And it says that's a good spot to be. If we were closer to the center of the galaxy, radiation would be just huge because there are so many more stars there. And there'd be a lot more galactic nucleus outbursts, they're called, and more supernovae. And so you'd have no life. What if we were further out? That's not good either. Stars further out are orbited by planets smaller than Earth. That'd mean no atmosphere. It says something happens when they're further out, there's no atmosphere. You couldn't have plate tectonics. And said, that's amazing. Said the authors of a couple of books have looked at this and said that our galaxy is better suited for life than about 98% of the other galaxies near us, or even this galaxy is exactly shaped right. It has a more ordered orbit, unlike some other galaxies. And said there are more interstellar clouds that would be bad news if we ran into them in other galaxies. So those are just some of the things he's talking about. There are more chapters dealing with this fine-tuning, and I'd like to cover that another time. But that just gives you, I hope, a feel for what Metaxas is up to. Fun reading him because I wasn't able to give you a real feeling for the joy that you can have reading it, the way he writes his sentences. He kids around some. He's got some interesting word choices. But the book is called Is Atheism Dead? And Metaxas is the author. Anything Metaxas puts out is worth reading, so I hope you have a chance to read him. And we'll come back to this book in a future podcast. Thanks for being part of this one.